So we've got questions right now. We're ready to begin with Professor Zhang, Ambassador Freeman, and Professor Bardhan. Number one.
Charlie Graham, Camden, Maine. I think all of the speakers have alluded to the potential for internal trouble in China and the lack of understanding with the United States in particular. Do any of you see a chance that internal unrest in China might lead to some effort by the government to create a foreign hostility problem in order to divert the local unrest?
I tell you, whoever wants to answer, Jazz, begin.
That's not impossible to imagine, but I think the greater danger would come from the democratization of China, because the sense of nationalism and aggrievement at the complex history that several speakers, including myself, have alluded to is so great. We've seen other cases where the introduction of democracy, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, has resulted in the exacerbation, not the amelioration of deep fissures. But you asked two questions. The first one really had to do with the brittleness of Chinese governance. I think that is a serious issue. I agree with both Professor Lan and Professor Pranab. That is to say, I'm reminded years ago when I was learning Chinese in Taiwan, everybody complained about the rule of the Kuomintang, which was then the Leninist party, an authoritarian regime. And they said, it's corrupt, it has no vision, it's officially socialist but ignores its ideology, it lost the Civil War, it's lost the mandate of heaven, it's terrible. So after hearing this quite a bit, I had the temerity to say, well, if that's the case, why don't you get rid of it? And I got a universal answer. Are you crazy? First of all, life is getting better. Standard of living is going up. My kids are going to be better off than I am. These guys are bums, but they're not doing a bad job at delivering on the goods. Second, there isn't any alternative. Somebody's got to be in charge, and this is what we've got. Third, if we were to try to overthrow them, they'd probably shoot us. So I ask the same question on the mainland of China now. I get the identical answer. This illustrates the point about the red line. That is to say, Chinese government derives its legitimacy now from delivering the goods. It delivers what constituents want: jobs, rising living standards, greater opportunities. If it fails to do that, there is very little tolerance for this regime on which to fall back. The characterization of India, which I spent 3 years living and working in, I agree with entirely. The downside of that is that there's very little popular drive to address the problems of the country, infrastructure deficiencies and other things that blight its future to some extent. In China, oddly enough, the system is both brittle and responsive to popular desires.
Professor Bardhan.
Go ahead.
I want to add something to this. In terms of the unrest,
Sure.
yes, I agree with Ambassador Freeman about the leadership providing the goods, so something going well, why disrupt it? In some respects now, you see some discontent arising even in the middle classes about some goods not reaching them, and that is to do with housing. There is a property bubble that's going on in China right now. So there are a lot of middle-class people who are complaining now that they cannot afford housing.
And food.
Quite often food, but housing is very important. In fact, I don't know how many have read in the newspapers that there was a crazy guy, and there are crazy guys all over the world, who stabbed some school children. And if you read the story of that guy is not a very poor, deranged person. He's a doctor in a hospital. Minor doctor, junior doctor, but hospital. But he could not afford to buy an apartment. So he lives with his younger brother and mother. And since he does not have an apartment, he cannot date girls. He's getting frustrated, more and more frustrated. And in the United States, you would have shot people, but in there, guns are not that easily available, so you stab people. But the frustration is because of denial of access to some goods which the middle classes want. And I think it's the unrest question, I think is ultimately related to the middle class. A democracy question is also related to middle class, but I think it's a myth that middle classes bring democracy. There are many parts of the world, Latin America, Southern Europe, where middle classes have gone along with dictators. In China, the leadership tried to co-opt the middle classes, connecting high economic growth with nationalist glory, and that co-opts the middle class quite a bit, and that's why the red line is important. So in a sense, I'd say to many people that the Chinese leadership is riding a tiger. This tiger, which gives the high growth, legitimacy, and so on, nationalist glory, so it cannot afford to dismount that tiger very easily. And yet, I think the major danger for China, I've stated this to my Chinese friends in China many times, the major problem is going to be ultra-nationalism in China. From the Chinese point of view, that's what one should look out for.
This was a great question, Charlie. So, Professor Zhang, why don't you wrap it up?
Well, I agree with they said. I just want to add one point is that, yes, the Chinese regime's legitimacy is entirely based on the ability of continue to deliver. Therefore, they cornered themselves in that sense. But the question in my mind is, do they know that? Yes, they know that. And Chinese happen to be history conscious. They knew 8%, 9%, 10%, no country can sustain that for 30, 50, 70, or 100 years consecutively. So they always have, in their mind, the crisis management, the crisis is going to come, or maybe even come earlier. This is why they sometimes overreact, because they knew the crisis is coming at some point.
We got a question up in the balcony.
My name is Denny Gallaudet. I'm from Cumberland, Maine. Despite a long history of Chinese capital controls, just very recently, over 200 small Chinese companies are listed and trading on the U.S. NASDAQ. Should we consider this flight capital that's at risk of being repatriated?
Who wants to take that? Chaz, start.
No, it's not. It's not flight capital. It's something very different. It is, first of all, it's not just the NASDAQ, but the New York Stock Exchange also. For some reason, despite Bernie Madoff and all the rest of it, the world tends to regard the certification by the SEC, our SEC, as an important guarantee or certificate of financial probity. So there is great prestige attached to listing in the United States. Second problem is, and this was alluded to by Professor Bardhan, that is, capital markets in China are extremely underdeveloped. For the private sector in particular, it's often difficult to get access to financing on a reasonable basis. And going abroad represents an alternative method of bringing money into China. So far from being capital flight, it's quite the opposite. The final point, if you're an investor, you sound as though you might be, then you might want to take a look at U.S.-listed Chinese companies. If they are good companies, have a solid growth rate, that is, are profitable and increasing their profitability, and their assets are denominated in yuan, not in dollars, they're a pretty good bet. They will grow, like any other good company will grow, and that will be reflected in the share price. But to the extent that the yuan is revalued, as it must be over time, you'll also benefit from that. So it's also a kind of hedge against the dollar, even though those companies trade in dollars here.
Chaz, that's terrific. You've turned this conference into sort of an investment advisory session, so we're going to have to charge more next year. Professor Zhang?
No, I agree with you.
Okay, good. We've got one more question down here at the rear, and then we'll take some from Rockland or Belfast. We got no questions last night from Belfast, so I hope you're going to ask some today. If you don't, we're going to take away the ability to do so and give it to Ellsworth. Okay? Yeah.
This is John McGaffin from Washington, D.C. I'd like to return to the theme of the first speaker of mistrust in the U.S.-Chinese relationship with specific reference to activities and ongoing situations. It's generally known that for the past many years, there has come from China a continuing and increasing series of attempts to exploit and penetrate U.S. information systems from the Chinese government, increasing number of instances. In every part of our information infrastructure, from the most classified networks of the defense and intelligence community to the private sector, to defense contractors for aircraft technology, to such apparently benign things as departments of agriculture and CDC, as well as congressional offices. So it's widespread. It's also commonly said in some cases this is just a wholesale enterprise by criminals and academics and hackers because they could, and it's not really fair to attribute it to the government of China. I find that hard to believe. You also have, we heard from Ambassador Freeman last night that, well, you know, the U.S. is trailing sonar arrays through Chinese war exercises. Is this just the same as that? What is the why? Why are they doing this, and what should we expect of it?
Well, first of all, every country does that. The United States does even more. I don't. You see, you know, at the operational level, I'm sure, you know, Chinese would utilize whatever assets they can have penetrate into the American system. But you know, I think your argument is you are more alarmed by the wider scope. But that's because engagement between China and the United States are multidimensional these days. So I don't see why they cannot do it. Well, but WikiLeaks seem to suggest Americans doing very well in the human assets in Beijing.
I know Ambassador Freeman has a comment, but,
Okay.
but before,
Right.
I think the questioner was focusing on the fact that this seems to be under the control more of the Chinese government, and it's a Chinese government-focused plan to go in, whether it's in
You mean hacking?
Yes,
Okay,
into a whole
that's
bunch
a different story. Yeah.
of different areas,
Right,
not just
right.
defense, but pharmaceutical,
Right,
et cetera, et cetera.
right, economic.
Would you have any comments on that?
I don't have a specific comment.
Yeah, okay,
I do
let's-
know some incidents. Yes.
But let's hear what Chaz says.
On the question of not cyber warfare, because it's not warfare, penetration of cyber systems. On one level, this is a response to the U.S. physical penetration of Chinese space with all sorts of surveillance aircraft and naval vessels. Asymmetrically, they have responded by invading our space, which is heavily dependent on computers. Why might they do that? Because there are reasons for the fundamental distrust that Professor Xiang referred to. Let me just tick off a few. The U.S., as I said last night, has apparently decided, with no discussion, that it is our mission in life to dominate the world. That is, from the Chinese point of view, a curtailment of their space, their autonomy, and an unwillingness to accommodate their return to wealth and power that is quite challenging. So they react to the challenge by questioning what we're doing. When they look at what we have done, they see a record that began with opposition to their revolution, efforts to frustrate its success, covert action programs in Tibet and elsewhere directed at destabilizing the Chinese state, frustration of the unification of their country and the restoration of its territorial integrity, which was destroyed by the era of colonialism, and other American actions, which altogether add up to a declaration on our part that we consider the Chinese system fundamentally illegitimate and would welcome its overthrow, peacefully if possible, but by whatever means that could occur. Read a congressional record for any day of the week, and you will see statements that correspond to this litany. And finally, of course, we have come up with the notion of peer competitor, which is, and we have decided that China is the enemy of choice in the high-tech area. It is the justification for major new weapon systems, and that sends a certain signal that inspires something less than confidence on their part about our intentions. There's another underlying issue here, and that is that there is a sharp contrast between the United States today and China today and the United States in the past. In the past, we stood for a world of diversity based on tolerance for other people's values, and we did not insist on conformity to our ideology, our way of life, our political system, our ideas. We do now insist on conformity. If you want to deal with us, we say, you must adhere to our norms in human rights, in politics, and other things. Chinese make no such demands. So there is an inherent tension between one party which wants conformity and the other party which is prepared to tolerate diversity. And that, too, leads to distrust.
It's an incredible comment, because if somebody heard you talk about one party that demands conformity and one party that demands diversity, you would think that the Chinese side was the conforming side and we were
the other way.
The diverse. We've got something from Belfast. Aha. For,
Okay, I can see.
for Lanjin Zhang, here, you can read right down there. You talked about trust and misunderstanding. How does China expect other countries to trust them when they prevent freedom of speech for their own people, i.e. internet lockout? Professor Zhang.
Yes, I agree totally that the Chinese regime rather panic about the freedom of speech and information. But I look at this, growing up in China, I look at this from historic perspective. In my days, I was, share my personal story, I was detained by police for 3 months at age 13, simply for listening to music of a Voice of America Chinese language transmission from Okinawa. Now, that's during the Cultural Revolution. Now, today, I just learned Voice of America Chinese program is shutting down because there's no need to use that as a propaganda instrument, because everybody listening to, I will say freedom of speech in China today, it's already, I think it's a quantum leap already taking place. Far from, perfect, a lot of problems. But, given some time, I think they have to release on that.
Okay.
I think the question is entirely valid, but I would translate it into somewhat different terms. Why should the world believe that a country which does not adhere to its own laws will respect international law and the rule of law abroad? Why does a country which breaks, why should we believe that a country that feels free to break its promises to its own people will keep its promises to foreigners. And I see this as the fundamental issue here. It is an issue about the rule of law. And finally, I would say that there's a corollary to this. If you wish to help Chinese to improve their own country's adherence to the rule of law, their performance in human rights, you do better by appealing to their government to be true to its constitution and its laws than by attempting to apply your own values or your own laws. The best arguments in favor of democratization are those which are made by Chinese, arguing from Chinese principles and in terms of Chinese laws. A little less arrogance and a little more empathy would go a long way in discharging our historic role internationally, not just in China, of supporting evolution toward greater democratic and human rights respectful regimes.
Chuck.
Good morning. Dwight from Westfield, New Jersey. Here at the Camden Conference, you have all very successfully challenged, I think, some of the conventional wisdoms we have about the Far East, and thank you for that. My question for you is that were this the Beijing conference or the Calcutta conference, and you were speaking on the challenge of the U.S., what misunderstandings or misapprehensions about the U.S. might you point out to audiences there? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Fortunately, the rest of the world know more about the United States than the United States know about the rest of the world. In fact, I remember once the German film director Wim Wenders, who has made lots of films about the United States, even though he was in Germany, and so he was asked, why do you make so many films about the United States? He said, what can I do? The US has colonized my subconscious. But having said all that, let me say, I think there's a tendency in all countries to identify what people think and what the government thinks. And I mean, similarly, for example, when we talk about Chinese, we often don't mention that it's like the Chinese government thinking, need not be the people's thinking. The same for India. Same, I think, for the United States. There is quite often a general impression that if there are certain things we don't like about the activities of the US government, as if that's shared by the general people. Yes, that government may be elected by the general people, but election is a multi-issue platform. So even if you don't agree with a particular government on many issues, you may elect that government. This is something that's not widely shared, that people don't distinguish between government's thinking and people's thinking. And that's something to an audience in Beijing or Calcutta, I'll certainly mention.
Professor Zhang.
Yes, I usually advise when in China that we calm down, despite the problem between U.S. and China, because the United States is in a relative decline. There is no doubt about it. There is something called post-imperial time lag. Americans, it takes time for Americans to do the real soul searching. Because after Cold War, Americans so triumphant, they win everything over Russians and everybody else. End of history. This is the only major power that has not started the soul searching. I don't consider Tea Party as part of that, you know. But they have to do it. They have to do it. Soft power of the United States was like a reservoir which was drained very quickly within a few years. And U.S. have to do re-examining their own behavior. Yes.
Jazz.
I have a very wise British friend who described the United States as king of the mountain, the king of the mountain that decided to kick down its own mountain.
Okay, we've got number 1, then we do number 3, then we do number 2. Anything more from the field? Okay, we'll have one from the field later. Yeah.
Thank you. Betty Robinson from the University of Southern Maine. I am interested in what the panelists believe would be some of the reaction and the thinking of leadership in China and India to the recent events in Egypt.
Who wants to begin? Okay, we'll start
I
with
think there is a, I've seen this in op-ed pieces in parts that, what's happened in Tahrir Square in Egypt, China beware. I think the connection is much too simple. The young people in Tahrir Square in Egypt did not share in the national pride that you see among the middle classes in China. The performance, the economic performance certainly, and also the rise in international status that China has enjoyed over the last few decades, something that you don't have a corresponding thing in Egypt. Secondly, many of these young people were motivated by severe economic problems. Unemployment, for example, is a huge problem in Egypt. This is not the number of jobs, high economic growth that China has produced. So it's not comparable. There is unrest in China related to corruption and inequality, which is similar. But I think, again, to draw the idea that immediately there will be similar kind of uprising, I think it would be much too simple. I find the Chinese government much too smart. They have been expert in containing local unrest. Whenever there is a local, if you count the number of unrest incidents in China, they come to 80, 90,000. However, look at how the Chinese government treats this unrest. Whenever there's some unrest, they immediately surround and contain it locally. They will arrest some of the leaders of the local unrest. They will sack the local officials against whom this unrest is. So in a sense, in opinion polls in China, it's the local officials who are the bad guys. Central leadership is still not as touched by the unrest because they do a very good job of containing. Now, how long they will be able to do it, it will depend on the internet. Internet is a two-edged sword. Internet is something the government uses to let the steam off, and the government uses sometimes to stoke nationalist incidents, whether it's against Japan or the United States. But the internet is also something that you cannot keep control of. There is a whole movement in China. It's called the rights activism, which is essentially spreading through the internet. So there is a similarity of the internet with Egypt, but I think most of the similarities are small in number. The dissimilarities are very large in number between Egypt and China.
Chaz and then Professor John.
Just to pick up on a point that Professor Bardhan made, all the polling data in China shows that percentages in the high 80s, around 90%, strongly approve of their system and government. The problem in China is not the sort of despair in the rulers that occurred in Egypt. It is a kind of cocky overestimation of how good the Chinese government is at doing what it does. So I think there is a fundamental difference. Notwithstanding that, for all the reasons that have been mentioned, the brittleness of the Chinese political structure, its dependence on economic results rather than political legitimacy to survive, gives the Chinese leadership an extraordinarily paranoid view of any civil unrest whatsoever, and leads to the kind of overreactions that both Professor Xiang and Professor Bardhan have alluded to.
Yes, I think Chinese leaders mixed feelings. On the one hand, they wanted to divert media attention from Mubarak billions, Swiss account, those kind of stories. That's something they don't want, But on the other hand, they opened they're quite open with policy debate. There are a lot of editorials debating the real reason why, because they believe Americans actually going to lose more in this game of Middle East unrest. As long as Americans continue to have trouble in the Middle East, there will be much less energy for West Pacific. That is what elite tone basically is. You know, they analyze very carefully, very much in detail.
So maybe they've been stirring the whole thing up in Egypt. All right, we're going to do one down here, and then we'll go back to the satellite.
Good morning. My name is Catherine King. I'm a public high school teacher in Hamden, Maine, about 50 miles north of here. My question goes to Professor Zhang's comments about the fundamental misreading of each other's nation's minds. It seems to me that the United States is in a particularly balkanized political period. I wouldn't know to which part of the American mind Chinese leaders ought to be listening. I wouldn't know how they would know to which American mind they should address their concerns, because as somebody else said, I'm quite sure it was not you, but I think it was one of the other two of you, the people don't always, there's not always consistency between what the general population thinks and what the government does. So I guess my question is, to whom would you suggest that the Chinese government listen? And to what part, no, I'm serious, and to what part of the Chinese mind should the American government direct its attention? Does, in other words, do the Chinese general populace have the same kinds of philosophical and political fragmentation that the American people now seem to have? And if that's true, is the American government missing the boat when it focuses its attention on the Chinese government?
Complicated question. Interesting.
Yes. Well, certainly, you know, I would say Henry Kissinger certainly is important here. Ambassador Freeman, another example. Anyone who has a strong, I would say, has a strong historic sense about this relationship, but it doesn't happen very often. Washington think tanks are not really do thinking these days. They do kind of short processing products for particular clients, the policy community, intelligence. You know, so this is the worst part would be the China hands who working in think tanks. The second thing I would argue, we have to start with the textbooks. You know, for high school teacher or even college professor, I taught in Clemson before for 5 years. You have a course called Western Civ. That is a fundamentally flawed course. You need to rewrite. Thank you.
You mean there is no Western civilization, or what?
This is a required course for everywhere.
Well, that does call to mind Gandhi's famous response to the question that he was asked when he landed in London. What do you think about Western civilization? He replied, I think it would be a good idea. I think Professor Xiang is right. Washington is now full of belief tanks, not think tanks. And finally, I just note in response to your question that confusing as we are to ourselves and to the world, China is increasingly confusing to us because we really haven't adjusted to the growth of a much wider freedom of expression in that country, not just on the internet, but a very vigorous press. The mainstream media here is dying. Beijing alone has 10 daily papers, which are very vigorously competitive and which contain all the usual sort of cheesecake and other stuff that sells papers. But they also contain a lot of lurid writing and provocative opinion that just doesn't represent more than kind of titillating the public sort of thing. It's not clear whether it has deep roots in the Chinese political structure at all. So we find them increasingly difficult to understand. And if I may, I would say I agree that there's tremendous misunderstanding and distrust that is a problem, but a bigger problem is that we recognize that, and we rather typically have done nothing about it. Consider flashpoints that could ignite a US-China crisis, and whether we have the mechanisms in place to deal with these. Imagine that Moody's finally displays some courage and removes our AAA bond rating as a country. And you have a financial crisis as a result. Now, are we really in a position to enlist the support of the Chinese, who would be essential to coping with that? What if there is a serious naval incident 12 miles off the China coast? We don't have a military dialogue to deal with that. What if the Korean situation takes a sharp deterioration? Perhaps there is an implosion in North Korea as part of a succession crisis. How do we deal with all of the military contingencies that arise in that context? Who takes possession of North Korea's nuclear weapons? What do we do about refugees? How do we stop North Koreans from firing strategic weapons at Japan in an effort to complicate the situation? What happens if South Korean forces go north? What level of tolerance for American forces nearing the Chinese border do the Chinese have? We don't have mechanisms for dealing with these things. There will be more arms sales to Taiwan, and Chinese tolerance of this is wearing thin. The Dalai Lama, in order to be reincarnated, has to die. And when he does, there may well be unrest in Tibet and a mess between India and China. What if, even in the absence of that, there is some sort of flare-up again on the Sino-Indian border, where both sides seem to be preparing for such an event? These are all things that could provoke serious crises in US-China relations, and we're not very well prepared to deal with them either intellectually or in terms of channels of communication, in my view.
It does sound like there's a lot for think tanks to do if they were thinking rather than just simply believing and putting out their own propaganda. We're going to take one from Belfast or Rockland. Rockland. Doesn't population growth have a negative impact on economic growth as well as a positive one? How will this play out in China and India? We'll start with India.
Well, that's related to the issue of demographic dividend that I discussed. Is the higher population growth rate in India, which is behind the India's population being younger. And as I already mentioned, younger population is more productive, saves more. So that's the positive side. But of course, with a higher population, once you have to take care of this larger population, which India, compared to China, has not done a good job of. And many of the problems in India are less to do with the growth rate. India's growth rate has been reasonably high. It's reaching out to the poor, the large masses of the poor people, particularly in terms of social services. It has to do with the population growth that India already has. Now, in the case of China, is the opposite problem that's come up. And in a sense, the gender imbalance that I referred to is a byproduct of the one-child policy. And it's something that China is going to be a serious social problem. I've seen studies in which, very rigorous statistical studies, where they try to understand the very high rise of crime in China. And of course, there are many reasons you can think why crime is going up. But if you control for everything else, the contribution of gender imbalance itself is very large. And this is going to be larger over time. So these are population growth has both, positive effects and negative effects, which are there both in China and India.
Okay. Professor Zhang?
Yes, China is very happy to yield that title they never like, most populous nation, to India. But we do have a serious problem, as already mentioned, the one-child policy. For this generation, at least, we are having terrible social problem. It's not just one single child who's going. How can they sustain the older generation? It is the mentality of that single child. In China, they are called the little emperors, because they were born into a situation where 6 adults, the immediate attention, constant attention of 6 adults, right? Parents and grandparents on both sides. That has become a very unhealthy social phenomenon. Suicide rates, all these problems, the ability of survive in the society, competitive society, these have become a real problem for China. So China has to relax on that policy.
We've got time for one more short question and short answer, and then we'll be ending at exactly 10:30. Please.
Yes. This is John Lloyd of Lebanon, New Hampshire, and it's addressed to, Professor Xiang, who had a very useful, I think, backgrounder to the Chinese rise to becoming a great power, in referring to the similar rise by Germany in the 19th century and the 20th century. I think it also might be useful, while that rise was certainly more dramatic, and of course the Germans are not held in high esteem, to also cite the American rise to becoming a noticeable power. We were not European, but we did pick a fight with the Spanish over what turned out to be the accidental sinking of the warship in Havana. We invaded the Philippines and liberated them from the Spanish by winning a battle there. But what is not often mentioned in the history books, that we also put down a native attempt at independence, which had a history behind it and good people heading it, by the Marines, which was 30,000 people killed in what is now called genocide. Now, I think it would be useful, because we are Americans, and this is part of America, to mention that kind of background.
What's the question, please?
The question is, would you do it?
About what?
Doing what?
What are we doing about what?
I wanted, in becoming a great power, the actions that we took before World War I, such as the actions you cited for Germany.
What China should, you mean?
As an example of coming to a great power. I thought your references to Germany was an example of the growth of a great power, and that China is becoming a great power, much as Germany did, much as we did, which goes back to before the First World War.
All right, we'll try to answer this. Professor Zhang, you want to give a shot at it?
I tried to figure out what do you mean. No, the Germans, they always have awkward foreign policy. The Kaiser is known to be the guy who talks constantly about, the German ambition. So I don't think Chinese are that naive or stupid. The advertising, its ambition or try to do. So I don't think it's a good comparison to begin with, the Kaiser Germany and China.
Ambassador Freeman has a comment.
Yeah, I think all of these analogies to our own predatory behavior on our own continent and beyond it, the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and the annexation of Hawaii as the culmination of manifest destiny, the Spanish-American War, analogies to Germany, the Soviet Union, revolutionary France, the British Empire, perhaps Japan. None of these work in the case of China. And the fundamental point Professor Xiang made, which I agree with, is China is not so much rising as resuming its traditional place in a region which has had a great deal of experience with China. China has been the dominant factor in that region for millennia, before the last 200 years of eclipse. So I look at China and I don't see the analogies. China has no ideology of expansionism like Manifest Destiny. China has no ideology it seeks to impose on others like the Soviet Union or sometimes the United States. China is not surrounded by weak countries like as revolutionary France was. The situation in Asia is not ripe for Chinese expansion. China does not, in fact, have a history of military expansion, partly for geographic reasons. It's not easy for China to expand. And China, unlike Japan, which reacted to being excluded from polite international company, not given a place at the table, and which was copying European powers that had practiced mercantilism and imperialism to secure raw material supplies. China doesn't believe in any of those things, and it is at the table as a full partner. So I just don't see the analogies, and I think we're much better off looking at China as it is, rather than as we imagine various other countries in the past might have been.
Thank you very much. Great.